The Holloway family was everything the small Texas town had come to admire, a picture-perfect image of stability and success. James Holloway, a dedicated soldier with multiple tours under his belt, was the type of man who could walk into a room and immediately command respect. His military career had earned him numerous accolades, and his stoic presence made him a local hero in the eyes of many. His wife, Lily, was the quintessential homemaker. She kept the house in pristine condition, raised their two young children with love and care, and hosted community events with a warm smile that made everyone feel welcome. Their two-story house was situated on a quiet street, surrounded by well-maintained lawns and friendly neighbors. It looked like the ideal family life, safe, loving, and perfectly aligned with the American dream. James had always been a proud soldier, committed to his work, often leaving for months at a time for deployment. He did what he loved and took pride in defending his country. But while James was overseas, Lily's life began to shift. The loneliness that came with being a military wife started to take its toll. As the years passed, it became more difficult for her to carry the weight of her isolation. She missed James desperately, but there was no way for her to fill the emptiness that stretched between their rare moments together. The long months without him left her feeling unseen and unappreciated, as though she were living in the shadow of her husband's larger-than-life career. It was during one of these lonely stretches that Lily met Michael. He had just moved into the neighborhood, a recently divorced man in his early 30s, with an easy smile and a charming demeanor. At first, their interactions were innocent enough. Michael would stop by for casual chats over the fence, talking about the weather or the neighborhood happenings. But it wasn't long before those simple exchanges turned into something more. Michael had an uncanny way of making her feel seen, like she mattered. He'd compliment her on her garden, bring her flowers, and make her laugh in a way she hadn't in years. For the first time in a long while, Lily felt special. What started as a friendship soon grew into something neither of them had expected. Michael's attention was intoxicating, and Lily found herself drawn to him in ways that confused her. She was still married to James, but the emotional distance between them had become unbearable. Michael, on the other hand, was fully aware of Lily's situation and seemed to relish in offering her the companionship she so desperately sought. Their meetings became more frequent, and before long they were sneaking around, meeting in secret when James was away. Lily told herself it was harmless, a brief escape from the emotional weight of her life. But deep down, she knew it was much more than that. What began as innocent flirtation quickly turned into a full-blown affair. The lines between right and wrong blurred, and Lily found herself caught up in the whirlwind of passion, guilt, and secrecy. She would tell herself that she was still a good wife and mother, that the affair was just a temporary distraction, something she could control. But as weeks turned into months, the reality of her actions became harder to ignore. The affair with Michael was a dangerous game, one that Lily had never imagined she would play. Yet, she kept telling herself that no one would ever find out. But deep down, she knew the lie she was telling herself couldn't hold forever. And that thought would become the haunting backdrop of the Holloway family's seemingly perfect life. As the months went by, Lily's double life grew more complex, and the weight of her secret began to feel unbearable. Her home, once a place of comfort and warmth, now felt like a prison. Every time she looked at her children, she was reminded of her love for them, but also of the deception she was living. The long stretches of James's absence meant that she had more time to herself, which allowed her affair with Michael to flourish. The guilt never fully went away, but it was easier to push it to the back of her mind when she was wrapped in the arms of someone who truly saw her for who she was, not just as the wife of a soldier. Her days became a delicate balancing act. During the day, she was a devoted mother, making sure her children's needs were met, baking cookies and attending PTA meetings. The house was always spotless, and the kids never suspected a thing. They saw their mother as the person who held everything together, strong, loving, and dependable. But at night, when James was away, Lily would slip away to meet Michael. Their rendezvous were always carefully planned. Early mornings, quiet afternoons, or late evenings when the house was still. Michael was her escape, her secret world where she wasn't just a wife or a mother, but a woman who was desired, who felt alive. But the cracks in her perfect life started to show. As time passed, Lily found herself becoming more distant from James, even when he was home. She tried to hide it, to play the role of the loving wife when he returned from his deployments, but it was difficult. James, though often preoccupied with his own work, began to notice subtle changes. The warmth between them seemed to evaporate. Conversations that once flowed easily became strained. He noticed that Lily seemed distracted, her eyes distant, and her smile no longer reached her eyes. It wasn't that he could pinpoint what was wrong, he simply sensed that something wasn't right. The more James tried to engage with her, the more she pulled away. His military background made him incredibly observant, and even though he couldn't put his finger on it, he was becoming increasingly suspicious. He chalked it up to stress from the long deployments, but deep inside he knew something had shifted. It wasn't just the distance between them, it was the sudden, noticeable change in Lily's behavior. He could feel it in the air, like a tension that neither of them could name but both could feel. Meanwhile, Lily's fear of being caught grew. The secrecy that had once been thrilling now weighed heavily on her. She was constantly looking over her shoulder, terrified that someone, anyone, might discover her betrayal. She even began to notice how much she had started to rely on Michael, how his presence was slowly filling the void James had left behind. But there was always a lingering doubt in her mind. Was this truly love, or was it simply a desperate escape from the suffocating silence of her marriage? Her world became a constant cycle of hiding, lying, and pretending. Every day felt like a tightrope walk, and the fear of her secret being exposed gnawed at her relentlessly. But she pushed it aside, choosing instead to immerse herself in the brief moments of happiness she found with Michael. She convinced herself that as long as no one knew, as long as she could keep the illusion of a perfect life intact, everything would be fine. But deep down, Lily knew the truth. Secrets have a way of coming to light, no matter how carefully they are hidden, and as her affair deepened, so did the dangerous tension that would eventually unravel everything. James returned home unexpectedly early from a deployment. He had been overseas for months, and while Lily had grown accustomed to his absences, his sudden arrival caught her off guard. She hadn't expected to face him so soon, especially not after everything that had been building beneath the surface. Their home, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt like a ticking time bomb. Lily's heart raced as she heard the front door open and James's familiar footsteps echoing through the hallway. The tension between them had been growing for weeks, but neither of them knew how close they were to the breaking point. James entered the living room with his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his tired eyes scanning the room. He seemed different, quieter than usual, but Lily couldn't place why. His military training kept him sharp, perceptive, and when he noticed that something felt off, he trusted that instinct. He immediately felt the shift in the air, the subtle distance between them, the coldness where there used to be warmth. His mind began to race with questions. What had happened in his absence? Why was Lily so distant? Lily tried to mask her nerves with a smile, greeting him warmly, but the fake cheerfulness didn't fool him. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of guilt, perhaps, that immediately sent a wave of suspicion through him. For months, he had dismissed the subtle signs. The way Lily seemed distracted when he called, the odd messages on her phone, the sudden shifts in her mood. But today, standing before her in their own home, he knew something was wrong. After a few moments of awkward silence, James couldn't take it anymore. He needed answers. His gut was telling him that this wasn't just a case of post-deployment stress. There was something else, something deeper. He asked her directly. The questions came in rapid succession, each one more probing than the last. Lily's heart pounded, her body frozen, as she realized the moment she had feared was here. The man she had betrayed, the man she had promised to love and cherish, was standing in front of her, demanding the truth. She hesitated. For a fleeting moment she considered lying, denying everything. But as his piercing gaze fixed on her, she knew she couldn't keep up the facade any longer. The affair had gone on too long, and it had started to consume her. She had convinced herself that it didn't matter, that the lies were harmless, that her affair with Michael was something she could manage. But in that moment, facing her husband, she realized just how far gone she was. She had lost control, and the consequences of her actions were about to catch up with her. Lily confessed. Her words tumbled out, stammering and barely audible, but there was no mistaking the truth. She admitted to the affair, to the deceit that had been festering between them for months. As the words left her mouth, the room seemed to close in around them. The air became thick, charged with the weight of her betrayal. James's face went pale, his eyes narrowing as the truth settled in. The man who had given everything for his country, the husband who had trusted his wife, felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. In the heat of the moment, the anger and hurt that James had been suppressing exploded. His military discipline faltered in the face of the deep wound Lily had inflicted. He shouted at her, his voice hoarse with disbelief and pain, but there was no satisfaction in the confrontation, no relief in finally knowing the truth. As the anger swelled within him, a darker emotion began to take hold. Jealousy, fear, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. Lily stood frozen, caught between the man who had once loved her and the man she had turned to for comfort. The room felt suffocating, and as the arguments escalated, neither of them noticed the danger building in the corners of their fragile home. It wasn't just the anger that was consuming them, it was the fear of what this confrontation might lead to. What started as an emotional confrontation quickly spiraled into something far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. The argument between James and Lily escalated in ways neither of them could have predicted. What had started as a conversation of hurt and betrayal quickly morphed into something much more volatile. James, his fists clenched and his face flushed with anger, couldn't hold back the emotions that had been building for months. The devastation of his wife's affair was like a physical blow, and he was no longer the disciplined soldier who could remain calm under pressure. The shock of Lily's confession pushed him to a breaking point, and he felt his entire world collapsing around him. Lily, on the other hand, was overcome with guilt and fear. Her heart hammered in her chest as she tried to explain, to make him understand the loneliness that had driven her into Michael's arms. But no words could heal the wound she had inflicted. The damage had already been done. She could see the fury in James's eyes, and for the first time, she realized just how much danger she was in. The love they once shared felt like a distant memory, replaced now by betrayal and pain. She wanted to calm him, to tell him that she never meant for it to go this far, but the words wouldn't come. She felt trapped, suffocated by her own actions. The tension in the room was thick, unbearable. The house, once a place of safety and familiarity, now felt like a battleground. Each word, each accusation fueled the fire. James's anger was raw, uncontrollable. He couldn't fathom how the woman he had loved, the woman who had promised to be loyal, could betray him in such a cruel way. The room felt small, the walls closing in on him as his frustration grew. In a fit of rage, he stepped toward Lily, his eyes burning with fury. He wasn't thinking clearly. All he could focus on was the pain he felt, the sense of utter betrayal that was threatening to consume him. Lily recoiled, her breath caught in her throat. The fear she felt was palpable. She had never seen James like this, the soldier who had always been calm under pressure, the man who had endured hardships without flinching, was now someone she barely recognized. It was as if he had become a stranger, a man filled with so much rage that she could see nothing but darkness in his eyes. The love they had once shared seemed like a distant memory, drowned out by the intensity of his anger. In that moment, everything seemed to unravel. The intensity of the confrontation reached a boiling point. Without thinking, Michael, who had been lurking in the background, waiting for this very moment, made his move. He had been hiding in the shadows, unseen but ever present, his mind clouded with fear and desperation. He had been prepared for this, knowing that things would come to a head eventually. The affair had been a dangerous game, and now it was spiraling out of control. In the chaos of the confrontation, Michael grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter. In one swift, panicked motion, he thrust it toward James, the weapon slipping into his chest before anyone could react. The room fell silent, the shock of what had just occurred reverberating through the walls. James staggered backward, his body going limp as blood began to pool beneath him. Lily's scream pierced the air as she rushed toward her husband, but it was too late. James was already slipping away, the life draining from him in front of her eyes. The world seemed to spin as Lily knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch his blood-soaked shirt. The reality of what had just happened hit her like a wave. This wasn't supposed to be how things ended. The affair, the lies, the secrets. They had all led to this unthinkable moment. James was gone, and there was no turning back. She had been caught in the crossfire of her own choices, trapped by the web of deception she had spun. Michael stood frozen, his face pale, the knife still in his hand. He looked at Lily, his expression one of both fear and disbelief. He hadn't meant for this to happen. The violence, the chaos, it was never part of the plan. But in the heat of the moment, in the desperation to protect their secret, things had spiraled out of control. Lily was left alone, her heart shattered by the consequences of her actions. The man she had loved, the father of her children, was dead, and she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. In the days following James's death, the Holloway family home was filled with a suffocating silence. The once vibrant house, full of laughter and the noise of children playing, now stood still and empty, as if the life had been drained out of it. Lily moved like a ghost through the rooms, her hands trembling as she went through the motions of daily life, though her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and horror. The events of that fateful night seemed unreal, like something out of a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She could still hear the echo of Michael's footsteps retreating into the night, his face filled with terror and regret. The man she had once believed could offer her solace had turned their lives into a tragedy she couldn't undo. The police arrived at the house soon after, called by a neighbor who had heard the commotion. When they found James's lifeless body, blood pooling beneath him, it didn't take long for them to piece together the grim reality. Lily was in shock, unable to explain how things had gotten to this point. The officers questioned her, but her answers were disjointed and fragmented. She couldn't even remember the exact moments of the confrontation. Only the fear, the rage, the shock of seeing James collapse before her eyes. She knew that whatever was to come, she couldn't escape the truth of what had happened. The investigation unfolded quickly. The discovery of Michael's involvement was not long in coming. He had been in the house during the confrontation, and his fingerprints were found on the weapon that had taken James's life. But Michael was gone. He had vanished into the night, leaving behind only the wreckage of his decisions. The search for him became a national story as the police traced his last known movements, but he had seemingly disappeared without a trace. Meanwhile, Lily was left behind to face the fallout. The guilt that consumed her was unbearable. She had loved James once, had built a life with him, but she had torn that apart for a fleeting escape in the arms of another man. And now her husband was dead, and the truth was out. The whispers of the affair, the betrayal, the murder. It all followed her wherever she went. Her friends, her neighbors, everyone she had once trusted, looked at her differently now. There was no escaping the stain of her actions, no way to undo the damage. The trial that followed was a media frenzy. The details of the affair, the escalating tension between James and Lily, the final violent confrontation, all of it was laid bare for the world to see. Lily's role in the murder was hotly debated. Was she an innocent bystander, a victim of Michael's rage, or was she complicit in what had happened? The prosecution painted her as a woman who had allowed her affair to spiral out of control, leading to the ultimate tragedy. The defense, however, argued that Lily was caught in a whirlwind of fear and confusion, unable to stop the violence once it had begun. But the truth was more complicated. Lily was torn between the woman she had once been, the loving wife and mother, and the woman who had betrayed her husband, and in doing so had set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. She didn't know if she would ever find forgiveness, from the world or from herself. The guilt gnawed at her every waking moment, and as the trial dragged on, she began to realize that there were no easy answers. As Michael remained at large, Lily's life became a constant reminder of the choices she had made. The house that had once been filled with the noise of children and the promise of a future was now silent, its walls echoing with the memories of what had been lost. The Holloway family was no more. The American dream they had once seemed to embody had shattered, leaving behind only the painful reality of what betrayal and secrecy could lead to. As months passed, the weight of what had happened settled like a constant, suffocating fog around Lily. The media circus surrounding the case slowly began to fade, but the trauma it had caused her remained. She had become a symbol of something darker, of the betrayal that could tear apart even the most seemingly perfect lives. Every corner of her life was a reminder of the choices that had led to her husband's death. The children, once blissfully unaware of the complexities of adult relationships, now lived in a world where their father was gone, and their mother was someone they could never truly understand again. Lily tried to move forward, but nothing felt real. Her friends avoided her, unsure of how to speak to her or what to say. Some pitied her, others judged her. Neighbors who had once waved at her from across the street now crossed the road to avoid her. She had become an outcast, trapped in the story of her own making. The memories of happier days, the family gatherings, the birthday parties, the quiet evenings by the fire, haunted her, mocking her for the life she had destroyed. Then there was Michael. He had vanished into the ether, leaving no trace behind. Despite the police's best efforts, there was no sign of him. The man who had been so central to the affair, the catalyst for the violence that had shattered everything, had disappeared without a word. The unanswered questions gnawed at Lily. Had Michael been in this as deep as she had? Or had he simply used her? His disappearance only added to her sense of loss, as if the final chapter of her life had been written by someone else, with no way to turn back. Eventually, the legal repercussions began to catch up with her. While she was not charged with murder, Lily found herself facing a different kind of reckoning. The courts ruled that she would be responsible for the children's future, but that was small comfort. She had become a woman trapped by the weight of her own mistakes, unable to outrun the consequences of a single, life-altering choice. Time moved on, but Lily would always be defined by the tragedy she had caused. The man she had loved was gone. The family she had once known was forever altered, and there was no way to undo the choices that had led to this point. She had learned too late that sometimes the price of seeking something forbidden is more than anyone can bear. And now, she would have to live with the cost for the rest of her days.